Get ready to step into a world where the unknown lurks in the shadows and the impossible becomes reality. Here, you will hear stories that defy logic, encounters with the unexplained, and mysteries that echo through time. Welcome, but be careful. Some stories are more than just tales. They are still alive. Good evening, my friend Luke. Good evening to all the listeners and subscribers of the channel. I live in front of a large cemetery in the city of Boston. I reside in a small apartment with my wife and my 2 children. Every day when we open the window, the first thing we see is the Granary Burying Ground Cemetery. At first it seemed like just a place of sadness and longing, but over time, strange things began to happen. To illustrate the story I'm about to tell, I'm also sharing a video that I made myself with some footage of the cemetery so that those who are not from the area can get an idea of what it's like inside. Seen during the day, it isn't scary at all, but when night falls, its atmosphere completely transforms. I wasn't the first person to witness strange events there, and I certainly won't be the last. My city is filled with supernatural stories, and the things I'm about to share are just some of the many real accounts that occur around here. The first night I saw something out of the ordinary was almost 2 years ago. I was in the living room, sitting by the window, when I noticed a light that wasn't coming from any street lamp or car. It was a faint light that seemed to float in the air. It moved slowly, without direction, and drew shapes that moved gently over the tombs. I saw it tracing the lines of the graves, forming outlines that resembled hand traces and simple geometric shapes. My wife was also looking from the kitchen and asked if I had noticed it. I simply replied yes, but I didn't know how to explain it. In the days that followed, the lights began to appear more frequently. On some nights, they would emerge just after midnight and linger for a few minutes. Once, my youngest son, who usually went to sleep early, woke up frightened. He pointed to the window of his room and said he saw a blue light that seemed to be dancing in the air. My wife went to check and was left speechless. The lights didn't follow any logic or direction. They appeared and disappeared as if they had a will of their own. One early morning, I was awake, unable to sleep. The clock read 2 a.m. when I heard a loud sound, similar to an explosion. It was as if a bomb had fallen on the cemetery. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but it was intense enough to make my window shake. I called my wife, who was sleeping beside me, and she woke up with a start. We sat in silence in the darkness, listening to the echoes of the blast repeating at regular intervals. We didn't know if it was the wind or something else, but the sound resembled explosions and filled us all with fear. Some nights were even more disturbing. Besides the lights and the sounds of explosions, we began to hear long, rhythmic whistling coming from the cemetery. I clearly remember one night when the whistling was followed by laughter. Laughter that seemed to come from afar, but that somehow filled the atmosphere with a sense of danger. My wife and I exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. We decided to close the windows and curtains, but the sound seemed to penetrate the walls. My children cried out in fear and asked us to stay with them. Gradually, the frequency of the manifestations increased. There were nights when the sounds blended together. First the explosions, then the whistling, followed by macabre laughter. On one of those nights, while I was sitting in the living room, I heard a voice calling my name. I froze, unable to speak. The voice was clear and came from outside, as if someone were standing right in front of the window. I called my wife, who helped me look. The faint light I had seen before intensified and seemed to approach the glass. The voice repeated my name, and for a brief moment, I felt that someone was there watching me closely. Little by little, I realized that we weren't the only ones noticing these occurrences. Neighbors also commented on the strange events. A lady from the adjacent building said she had seen figures slowly walking among the graves. They weren't shadows or reflections. They were people with an intense glow, as if each one carried its own light. On one occasion, while I was watching from the window, I saw the figure of a man moving slowly among the tombs. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and his eyes shone in an unusual way. Other residents reported seeing women in long dresses, seemingly wandering aimlessly through the cemetery. The events became a distressing routine for our family. Every night brought a new surprise. One Saturday, after an ordinary day, we were confronted with a more intense manifestation. I was in the living room when I noticed that the light that usually floated was forming more complex patterns. It drew straight lines and contours that unmistakably resembled faces and human figures. My children, who were playing in the hallway, stopped and stared fixedly at the window. My wife ran over to them, trying to calm them down, but the fear was plainly visible on their faces. Shortly after, the sound of explosions came. It wasn't a single blast, but several, with short intervals between them. Each explosion made the house tremble a little, and with each one, the lights changed color. Sometimes they were bluish, other times they took on a more orange hue. The whistling followed immediately, accompanied by laughter, this time louder and closer. I got up and went to the front door, trying to listen more intently. Outside, the sound blended with the noise of the city, but its origin was unmistakable. It was as if something or someone was announcing its presence, as if it wanted everyone to know that the cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. That same night, while everyone was on edge, I heard a voice calling my eldest son's name again. The voice was calm but carried a tone of urgency. He stopped playing and with wide eyes looked toward the window. My wife ran to his room, and I tried to understand where that sound was coming from. Then from outside, I saw two figures walking near the graves. One of them slowly approached the fence that separated the cemetery from our building. The glow emanating from that figure was strong, making every detail visible even in the darkness of the night. It wasn't possible to see his face, but the way he moved was deliberate and unhesitating. My friends, the events intensified over the months. On some nights, it seemed as if the cemetery came to life. The lights moved more quickly, forming patterns that transformed into human silhouettes. The sounds of explosions, whistling, and laughter blended together, creating an atmosphere of pure terror. One night, while I was sitting on the living room sofa, the apartment door slowly opened, even though it was locked. There was no wind, and no one else was around. It was at that moment that I heard a voice calling my name again, this time with such insistence that it made me quickly get up and slam the door shut. My children, who were sleeping, woke up from the noise, and the whole house filled with a silence laden with fear. More and more, the manifestations seemed intent on interacting with us. On one occasion, while we were having dinner, the television turned on by itself, showing security camera footage of the cemetery. In the images, several floating lights and figures walking among the graves could be seen. The picture was clear and detailed. I saw a woman in a white dress slowly walking toward the camera. There was no doubt that what we were witnessing was real. My wife grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, but the fear had already taken root in our lives. I began recording the events in a notebook. I wanted to document everything that happened, to try to understand if there was a pattern or if it was just a series of coincidences. In my notes, I described every detail: the way the lights moved, the sound of the explosions, the exact moments when the voices called our names, and the appearances of the intensely glowing figures. I couldn't find any logical explanation for any of it. Each entry left me more uneasy, yet also more determined to uncover the truth. For an entire week, there wasn't a single day without a strange event. On one day, while tidying up the living room, I opened the window to let in some fresh air. The moment the window opened, I saw a figure standing on the sidewalk. It was a tall man with pale skin and bright eyes. He stared fixedly at me for a few seconds before disappearing without a trace. I quickly closed the window, frightened by what I had just seen. Another night was especially memorable. I was lying on the sofa, trying to get some sleep, when I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I got up and went to the door, where the sound was louder. When I opened it, there was no one there. However, on the floor, there were marks that looked like footprints leading toward the front door. My hands trembled as I followed the tracks with my eyes. It seemed that someone or something had entered our home without our noticing. The climax of the events arrived on a cold winter night. I was in my bedroom about to sleep when I heard a loud noise in the living room. I got up and went to the window. Outside, the lights were more intense than ever, drawing figures that moved with precision. The sounds of explosions echoed throughout the neighborhood, and the whistling seemed to come from every corner. Then the door slowly opened, without anyone touching it. Outside, a figure stood out in the darkness. It was a person with a strong glow that illuminated the graves. Their steps were slow and firm, and with each movement, the lights around intensified. Luke, I clearly saw that person's face for a brief moment. It was an expressionless face, with eyes that seemed to pierce my soul. The voice that called my name came from nearby, as if the figure were right next to me. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the front door and opened it, expecting to see something or someone who could explain what was happening. But the street was deserted and silent, except for the distant sound of explosions and the whistling that seemed to accompany my every step. I returned inside with the feeling that something important was about to happen. That very early morning, the whole family was on high alert. My children slept with the lights on, and my wife and I stayed together the entire time. Then, once again, voices called our names one by one. First, my name was whispered near the door, then my wife's name echoed down the hallway, and finally, our children's names were heard from their room. Each voice sounded different, but all carried the same intensity and urgency. The lights seemed to respond to these voices, blinking in sync with each call. We stood motionless, unsure of how to react. Throughout the night, the manifestations continued. I saw people with an intense glow walking among the graves and approaching our window. On one occasion, a female figure passed right along the fence, staring intently at us. The glow emanating from her was so strong that it illuminated the surrounding area. I couldn't move a muscle, and my wife, standing beside me, also appeared paralyzed with fear. There was no time for questions or explanations. We simply watched, our hearts pounding, as the figure slowly disappeared into the darkness. The following days were marked by a strange silence. During the day, the cemetery seemed calm, as always, but at night, everything would happen again. The lights, the sounds, the whistling, and the voices. I began waking up several times during the early hours, always hearing some noise or seeing a light pass by the window. I even installed cameras in the apartment, but the recordings didn't reveal much. The cameras captured normal images during the day, and at night, flashes of lights and shadows appeared, but without enough detail to identify what or who they were. I tried talking to other residents in the building. Some said they had experienced similar events, while others preferred not to comment. A neighbor who had lived in the same apartment for many years mentioned that the cemetery already had a reputation for being an unusual place. He claimed that decades ago, some strange events had occurred there and that people in the area usually avoided discussing the subject. This information left me uneasy, yet more determined to uncover the truth. I continued recording everything in my notebook. On each page, I noted the time, the type of manifestation, and the actions that were occurring. I made simple sketches of the outlines that the lights formed, and I wrote about every explosion sound, every whistle, and every voice. I noticed that the events did not follow a fixed order, but always occurred in a sequence that made the atmosphere seem more alive. It was as if the cemetery had its own routine, one that intensified during the early hours and waned during the day. On one of those nights, the situation reached a critical point. I was in the living room with my family, and the lights were especially strong. The drawings in the air appeared to form words, though I couldn't decipher what they said. Suddenly, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside. I went to the window and saw a tall figure moving in a slow, determined manner. It passed among the graves, leaving a trail of glow that illuminated the ancient stones. The figure stopped for a moment in front of the window and, without hesitation, called my name in a firm tone. It was the first time I felt that the manifestation was trying to communicate directly. I opened the window, and for a brief moment, the figure stood still as if waiting for a response. I said nothing. I simply remained there, observing. After a few seconds, the figure continued on its way and disappeared among the trees bordering the cemetery. At the same moment, the apartment's front door opened by itself. My wife, frightened, held our children's hands and looked at me. There was no explanation for that. Everything happened very quickly, and a sense of danger spread throughout the area. From that day on, the manifestations gained a strength I had never seen before. The nights became increasingly long and intense. The sounds of explosions, whistling, laughter, and voices began occurring almost every early morning, leaving no room for silence. The floating lights became so frequent that it seemed impossible to close one's eyes without seeing something moving in the air. The appearances of people with an intense glow also multiplied, and on several occasions they seemed close enough to touch the window. One early morning, while I was sitting in the living room trying to understand the sequence of events, I heard my wife's voice calling from the bedroom. I got up in a hurry and went there, but she wasn't there. The room was empty. Only my children's toys scattered across the floor, as if they had been abandoned in a rush. I ran to the other rooms, calling for her, but the only response was the sound of whistling seeping in through the cracks of the doors. Desperation overwhelmed me. I returned to the living room and sat near the window, trying to identify where those voices were coming from. It was then that the lights began to stir in the air and form outlines that resembled faces. One of the faces resembled my wife's, but with empty, expressionless eyes. I got up, determined to leave and seek help, but the sounds grew louder. The explosions drew nearer, and the whistling became more intense. The voices repeated each of our names insistently and almost threateningly. It was the longest night I have ever experienced. I felt powerless before a force I couldn't explain. I ran to the phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the line went silent, and the phone began hissing on its own. Terror filled the space, and I knew nothing could stop what was happening. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, the manifestations ceased. The cemetery seemed calm, as if nothing had occurred during the night. I tried to explain to the neighbors what we had been through, but people preferred not to listen. The day's routine returned to normal, yet what we experienced was forever etched in each of us. Still, I couldn't help but wonder whether that silence was merely a pause, or if it was laying the groundwork for something worse. I decided that I needed to understand what was happening better. I began talking with longtime residents of the area, people who had lived there for many years. Some told me stories of disappearances and of individuals who claimed to have been visited by spirits. Others said that the cemetery had a different energy, a weight that made the night feel denser. There was no consensus or logical explanation for the events, but everyone agreed that something abnormal was occurring in that place. Luke and friends, I no longer have any answers. I simply continue to wait, observing and recording every phenomenon as the darkness grows ever thicker and the feeling that evil is drawing near becomes inevitable. The cemetery remains silent during the day, but at night it comes alive and manifests with a force I could never have imagined. This is my story, told with the only truth I know. These events are not the products of imagination, but of real occurrences unfolding every night, from which I cannot escape. And if today the darkness is thicker than ever, it only confirms that this cemetery has plans that surpass human understanding, and that somehow we are bound to them, with no chance to escape the terror they bring. My decision was to put the apartment up for sale, but that is a process that takes time. To this day, few people have shown interest, but I believe the stories about that cemetery have already spread throughout the city, and I seriously doubt I will ever be able to sell it. The priest from a nearby church even came here, and we held a service in an attempt to make these manifestations cease, but they persist to this day. I'm tired of being called a liar when I recount these events to someone, and I admit that if I hadn't experienced it all and seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it. I really don't know what else to do. Thank you very much for watching our video until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Have a haunted night, everyone, and see you next time.